From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Sue Vita, the Chief of the Music Division here at the Library of Congress, and I am really so pleased to welcome you all to the Montpelier Room for another installment in the Library of Congress American Musicological Society Lecture Series. Maybe I need to pull this down a little further. This is meant to share the meaningful scholarship that members of the Society have conducted in the music division's vast collections. I remember sitting at the conference in 2007, I think, and talking about starting this series and wondering whether it would be something which could succeed and could endure, and so delighted to see how well we have done and what good scholarship we have been able to highlight throughout the series. We inaugurated the series with a presentation from Judith Tick about her research on Ruth Crawford Seeger. And since then, AMS members have come to the library to present research on a diverse array of topics from Schoenberg to Showboat. Tonight, we will learn more about uncovering Jewish activism within our sheet music collections, specifically in the Irene Heskes collection of Yiddish American popular songs. Tonight's lecture is being recorded for webcast and will be made available on the Library of Congress website and YouTube channel, along with the nearly 20 lectures presented thus far in the series. It is our hope, aside from celebrating musicological research in the music division's collection, that the series inspires other scholars to take advantage of the Library of Congress and our music collections, both online and in the reading room. I am now pleased to introduce Dr. Ronit Shiter, who specializes in contemporary music and Israeli music and has served on the faculties of the Peabody Conservatory at Johns Hopkins, George Washington University, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and American University in Washington, D.C. She is also affiliated with the Jewish Music Research Center, Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Let's welcome to the microphone Dr. Shiter, who will offer greetings from the American Musicological Society and introduce tonight's guest lecturer. Dr. Shiter.
Thank you, Sue. I would like to welcome you to our actually celebratory 20th lecture of the lecture series of the American Musicological Society in collaboration with the Music Division of the Library of Congress. This lecture completes actually 10 years of this fruitful collaboration of two distinguished lectures per year, all available as webcast if you just search AMS-LC lectures. As Sue said, we began here in 2008, and it was in the Coolidge Auditorium with Sue introducing Judith Tick on Ruth Crawford. These lectures are presented by musicologists who have conducted research here or virtually here, now you can do it all virtually online, at the archives of the Music Division that Sue heads. These presentations are obviously and generally supported by the help of the Music Division's excellent librarians. So we are all indebted to you. Thank you. I had the honor to give two presentations actually here at the Library of Congress, not part of this series, though. They were invited by the Hebraic section and were delivered in the African and Middle Eastern reading room, but they were certainly centered on the field of Jewish studies and music. and as a co-founder with Clara Moritz of the AMS Study Group on Jewish Studies and Music in 2010, I'm especially honored to be requested on behalf of the American Musicological Society to welcome you and to introduce to you tonight our speaker, Professor Randall Goldberg. Goldberg is Associate Professor of Musicology and Director of the Dana School of Music at Youngstown State University in Ohio. He is a contributor to the CPE Bach, The Complete Works, focusing on Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach's St. Luke Passions, and also to the Oxford Dictionary of the Middle Ages. His 2011 dissertation at Indiana University looked at the Zarlino-Galileo dispute. Beyond early and Baroque music, he just to reveal a bit of his encyclopedic knowledge, Professor Goldberg's primary instrument is guitar, and he directs the early music ensemble in his institution. He taught courses on various topics like rock and roll, German opera of the 19th century, American song, Gustav Mahler, and musical borrowings. However, his current research in the last few years focuses on the music of Jewish immigrants in America. Goldberg is also doing a lot of work as a public musicologist. He was the past president of the Agony chapter of the American Musicological Society, and currently he's serving as the executive committee board of directors of the Youngstown Jewish Community Center. Goldberg has presented on this topic at public and academic forums, including the Conference on Jewish Music and Jewish Identity, which he actually organized and hosted in Youngstown University in 2014. The conference presented some of the leading scholars in the field of Jewish studies and music, whose work Goldberg edited in a special volume of the Journal of Music Identities earlier this year, just published. Goldberg also publishes in Musica Judaica and Notes, and he is a very proud father of 2 kids, as I hear today. His presentation today is titled The Kishineff Massacre and Domestic Musical Practice in America. It unfolds the broad context of Herman Shapiro's 1904 solo piece piano by the same name, Kishineff Massacre. It is a descriptive composition written just a year after the first Kishineff Pogrom, and Goldberg chose to invite to this presentation the musicologist Jonathan Yeager, who is also a pianist, organist, and on the music history faculty at Juilliard, who focuses on music, politics, and the culture of post-war Germany. I'm certainly looking forward to the opportunity to hear the musical examples live with pianist Yeager. Goldberg presented earlier version of this Kishineff Massacre presentation, not only in his own 2014 Youngstown Conference on Jewish music and Jewish identity, but also at the AMS National Meeting in Louisville, 2015, and in SUNY Fredonia in 2016. I'm looking forward very much to hear this version, which will be available for all of us as a webcast at the AMS Library of Congress lecture series. Please join me in welcoming Professor Randall Goldberg.
Well, good evening, and thank you all for coming. And thank you, Ronit, for that introduction. I'm grateful to have this opportunity to present my research in this forum and share this unique piece of history. I especially want to acknowledge Bob Judd, Executive Director of the AMS, and Kate Miller and David Plylar of the Library of Congress, who have been so helpful in setting up my accommodations, my logistics, spreading word about the event. So thanks very much. I also want to thank my dear friend Jonathan Yeager for being here and playing piano for this presentation. I'll begin by telling you a little bit about how I got into this research project. About a year after I completed my Ph.D. dissertation on Italian Renaissance music theory, I just happened to be minding my own business at the Youngstown Jewish Community Center when the executive director of the center approached me to see if I was interested in taking home the JCC's collection of dusty 78 RPM records. He was just looking for a chump who could help them clean out some closet space, but I'm kind of a sucker for free records and free CDs and other media like that, so I took the bait. The collection contains many sacred recordings by star cantors, novelty songs, comedy skits. There are even some records that have Yiddish songs and Latin dance craze tunes on the other side. So what I did was I started looking at the records and ended up making a little database of them. And I thought, this is interesting, but what would happen if I looked at more records? And I ended up creating a database of about 6,000 records, which I did from using online catalogs, and printed discographies, and basically getting information, reputable information from wherever I could find it. I also spent some time at the YIVO, which is the Yiddish Institute in New York City, and also at residency at the Judaica Sound Archives in Florida Atlantic University. In that initial collection, the disc that interested me most was a recording of a descriptive overture called the Kishineff Pogrom. And I had two questions for this record. First of all, why would Jews want to listen to it? And why would anyone want to listen to a musical depiction of a recent atrocity? What's the point? Wasn't living it enough. So that was my first question. And the second question was, what are the sounds on these records supposed to represent? If this describes a pogrom, how do I connect the notes to what a pogrom is? So in investigating these things, I found that there's actually a fascinating history here. And I put it all together with mostly by studying sheet music that's in the Irene Heskes and other collections in the Library of Congress. So another reason why I'm very glad to present this research here. In case you're not familiar with the Kishineff Pogrom, Kishineff, or Chisinau, is the current capital of Moldova. And at the time of the pogrom in 1904, Jews made up about 30% of the population. In the years leading up to the pogrom, the Besarbets, a local newspaper edited by the rabid anti-Semite Pavlachi Krushevan, printed a number of articles against the Jewish community. In 1903, he found the perfect catalyst to set off the violence that was to come. 2 Christian children had been found dead in the area around Kishinev, and Krushevan claimed that Jews had murdered the children and drained their blood to make matzah for Passover. And this is a classic kind of lie told about Jews when people need to justify violence against them. And in case you're not familiar with Jewish practice, Jews have never used blood to cook. It's not kosher, so it's just not something we would do. Nevertheless, on Easter Sunday of that year, mobs headed into the Jewish areas of the city, and they murdered many people, and then they raped and pillaged for several days. It was this atrocity that inspired the music that I'm now going to discuss. The Kishineff Pogrom of 1903 is one of many events memorialized in Judaism's tragic past. Although the number of casualties does not compare with the Holocaust or even many other pogroms, the massacre had a great influence on Jewish activism, even for those who had already immigrated to America. Indeed, in a 2013 lecture on Kishinev at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, historian Stephen Zipperstein claimed that the fallout of the pogrom inspired Jewish American involvement in not only the creation of the NAACP and the ACLU, but also the election of President Barack Obama. Furthermore, Zipperstein argues that the extraordinary response to Kishinev, which played heavily in American and Yiddish American newspapers, was fueled by an important Zionist leader who coincidentally resided in Kishinev. Indeed, Jacob Bernstein Kogan directed a Zionist post office out of Kishinev, which he used to communicate activities throughout Russia and beyond. In the immediate aftermath of the pogrom, he energized his network of international connections to disseminate information about the violence. Descriptions and eyewitness accounts in the press were accompanied by benefit concerts, poetry, books, and new music. The speed at which new artifacts about the pogrom appeared is remarkable. In fact, the New York Times Tribune reported in 1903 that one Yiddish theater staged a dramatic reenactment of the massacre within 48 hours after it occurred. Producers of the reenactment did not strive for a literal presentation of the events, instead basing the action on previous atrocities. Their underlying messages about the need for Jews to find a homeland, however, were already familiar and superseded specific details. I want to briefly show some of the newspapers from which I'm getting all this information about all the press releases. And these are documents that anyone can go to the Library of Congress website, and you can actually search for individual words like Kishineff, and it'll bring up where Kishineff occurs in any paper. So it's just an amazing tool, and you can learn so much from this. Here's a page from the New York Daily Tribune, 1903, and we can see in the top of this column a letter from Kishineff about the events. Later down here is an article about the Russian ambassador to America, who's complaining that the news is all exaggerated and it didn't really happen. Here's another page from the St. Louis Republic, and we see there's an article about a family in St. Louis whose father escaped and how they're trying to bring the family to America from Kishineff. There's an article about Israel Zangvill's statements about the pogrom. Zangvill was a very famous playwright who coined the term melting pot, so he's an important figure in American letters. There's no end to what you can get from just doing basic archival work in these new newspapers. Much of the media coverage strove to promote a Zionist agenda as well as raise funds for the victims. For example, an article in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, seen here, begins with the question, "What is the lesson of Kishineff?" and responds, "Ringing around the world, loud and clear, voiced by the great leaders of Zion comes the answer. Return to Palestine, rebuild the temple, resurrect the nation." Furthermore, new books on anti-Semitism in Russia also urged a solution to the Jewish problem. The Irish activist and statesman Michael Davitt visited Russia immediately after the pogrom and wrote articles about it for William Randolph Hearst's newspapers. His reporting served as the basis for the book Within the Pale, The True Story of Anti-Semitic Persecution in Russia, which he published later in 1903. Although Davitt claimed to be in line with the spirit and program of anti-Semitism in some cases, he argues that he wrote the book to put forward a plea for the objects of the Zionist movement. In addition to book-length discussions and reactions in the newspapers, gruesome poems like Shimon Frug's Hot Rachmanis, or Have Mercy, were disseminated widely to inspire sympathy in fellow Jews and raise funds for survivors. There were also musical works published in the aftermath, and the Library of Congress's collection includes many examples. I just have a couple here of many that you can look at online or I guess see in the library. The first, Hot Rachmanis, is a setting of the poem. Someone took Shimon Frug's poem and set it as a song. The second, The Farewell of the Jews to Kishineff, is a descriptive piece, like the work I'm going to speak in detail about, and also written as a response to the pogrom and ways of get people involved with the issues of Jews in Europe. So there are many other examples. I just chose a couple. Shimon Frug's poem also inspired Herman Shapiro's 1904 Kishineff Massacre, a descriptive work for solo piano. Featuring a series of short musical tableaux, Shapiro designed his composition to bring the severity of the pogrom into the living rooms of American Jews and, we can assume, to move their hearts to joining the Zionist cause. Shapiro's affective score, with its ties to Western European musical traditions and foregrounding of what we might call stereotypically Jewish elements, stands out as a useful point of departure to discuss how composers marketed Jewish catastrophe, educated listeners and performers on the plight of their brethren in Europe, and pressed for Zionist action. Shapiro's Massacre can also help us decode other musical media about Kishineff whose aesthetic logic is not as clear, such as the record, which I will discuss later. Herman Shapiro appears to have been quite successful in marketing tragedy to Jewish audiences. The printed preface to the score of his Dr. Herzl Elegy includes a testimonial from a concert he gave in 1899, and it reads, "There was given recently in Louisville a genuine Hebrew concert. The program was distinctly Jewish in character. The whole tragedy of Israel found utterance in the eloquence of the music. Every feast of gladness and every day of sorrow and oppression had its record in melody." End quote. The same review claims that everybody present who heard the, quote, plaintive cry of his own people, end quote, responded sympathetically to the music. It seems that Shapiro and his live performances received the same reaction from audiences that he hoped would occur in the living rooms and salons of the Jews who would purchase his Kishineff Massacre. The printed score, published by Randall Goldberg in 1904, is as striking as the music it contains. The bright red cover, attention-grabbing in its own right, frames a ghastly illustration of the pogrom. In the foreground, angry Russians whip an elderly man and strangle a young woman, while a naked toddler inexplicably flies through the air. A silhouetted mob in smoke fill the background, which is outlined by a whip and a bloody sword. The macabre image is more than suitable to attract Jews looking to contemplate or memorialize suffering, and the Yiddish titles betray the marketing intentions of the publisher. Inside the cover, we find the Yiddish text and the English translation of Shimon Frug's poem, Hot Rachmanis. Its inclusion in the score and connections to the music, which I will discuss below, help us understand the function of Shapiro's piece as a tool for domestic entertainment and edification. The Kishineff Pogrom may be a novel subject for a solo piano work, but the structure of Shapiro's composition follows a formula common to instrumental battle pieces, which were popular in America during and just after the Civil War. A full history of musical depictions of battles would take us back centuries in the Western European canon and include clever and entertaining works by Clement Janikin, William Byrd, Heinrich Bieber, and even Beethoven's much criticized Battle Symphony titled Wellington's Victory. According to Richard Crawford in America's Musical Life, however, most American composers modeled their battle pieces on the Bohemian František Kočvara's Battle of Prague, which was first published in the 1780s. Kočvara's setting depicts Frederick the Great's victory over the Austrians during the 7 Years' War through a series of short musical episodes. He writes in common Western musical topics, such as march rhythms, horn calls, and Sturm und Drang passages, to represent the preparations for and execution of warfare. The music was first published in the U.S. in 1793 and inspired many new solo piano works based on American battles from the Revolutionary and Civil Wars, as well as the Spanish-American War a century later. Musicologist Elizabeth Morgan has recently published research on Civil War battle pieces, and her conclusions about these works are helpful in understanding Shapiro's music for Kishineff. First of all, Civil War battle pieces were composed for domestic performances, especially by amateur female pianists. The importance of acquiring piano skills for young women at the turn of the 20th century is well documented in home journals, music periodicals, and other literature of the time. In one 1892 book-length guide for housewives titled Queen in the Home, Emma Churchman Hewitt considers piano playing as a key component of homemaking, but lamented conditions in which, quote, daughters were expected to make night hideous and their lives a burden by their weary hours of practice, end quote. Even Jewish women, many of them being first-generation immigrants, sought to prove their talents on the piano. Joseph Rumshinsky, one of the most prolific Jewish composers and arrangers of the Yiddish theater, published many didactic musical works and describes his clientele in his memoir, Klangen von mein Leben. He writes, "From 10 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, I taught young women, recently married, who wanted to show their husbands they could play piano. From 3 until 7, I taught school children. And then from until 10 or 11 in the evening, I taught shop girls and office girls who wanted to get married." Rumshinsky's students may have been looking for a husband, but their skills would have also served as a conduit for the edifying messages contained in works like Shapiro's Kishineff Massacre. The battle pieces served as an entertaining vehicle for families to celebrate their side's military achievements. Long before Facebook news feeds and Twitter, battle pieces also supplemented journalistic reports, providing intricate details of the fighting with a descriptive and stirring musical accompaniment. Not surprisingly, Northern publishers printed works based on Union victories, and the triumphs of the Confederacy were covered by Southern presses. Shapiro's massacre seems counterintuitive in this regard, as the pogrom was certainly not a victory for Jews to celebrate. On the other hand, the battle genre offered appropriate means for transplanted families to relate to the instability of Jewish life in Europe while strengthening the piano technique of young women eager to enter respectable society. Shapiro could have modeled the composition on reports of the pogrom posted in U.S. papers. As early as May 1903, the New York Times and The Sun published unsettling eyewitness accounts of the violence. But Shapiro's descriptive music mostly ignores specific details in favor of stock musical topics commonly found in battle pieces. For example, many battle pieces include a morning bugle call or reverie. And this is the one from Kochvar's Battle of Prague, and it's trumpet music. This one goes ba-ba-da-dum, ba-ba-da-dum, bum-ba-dum, ba-ba-dum, bum-ba-dum, bum-ba-dum, ba-da-dum, and so forth. This is one from the Battle of Gettysburg, and again, very much what we think of as trumpet music, ba-ba-ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-bum-bum-bum, and so forth. Although the published accounts of the pogrom do not feature a bugle call, Shapiro includes the bugle call of the rioters. Another obligatory section of battle pieces is a musical depiction of the violent acts of war itself. Attack music has a long history in Western classical music. For one prominent example, the Italian composer Claudio Monteverdi suggested in the 1638 preface of his 8th book of madrigals that an agitated or violent affect could be rendered in music through a succession of quick, repeated notes. He put his theory into use in the dramatic Combattimento di Tancredi e Clorinda, or Combat between Tancredi and Clorinda. In this short excerpt, the narrator describes a deadly duel between the title characters. Monteverdi's so-called agitated style caught on throughout Europe and can be heard in countless pieces that describe battles, storms, and violent behavior. In the late 18th century, composers for the piano often used dexterous passage work at a quick tempo to represent military action. And here's the attack music from Kochvar's Battle of Prague. And you can see the quick Alberti bass figure in the piano, and then these melodic figures, two of them that I have circled, I'll come back to in a second. Shapiro's attack music, what he labels as the hellish work in full force, fits this paradigm, and the principal motive is clearly borrowed from the Battle of Prague. So you see the same figure. It goes kind of like da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And it's the same as the figure in Kochvar's attack music. Elizabeth Morgan notes that in Civil War battle pieces, the attack music always stays in a major key. Shapiro, in contrast to this tradition, tried to represent an attack on Jews in his music and adds chromatic tones to create Jewish-sounding harmonies. At first, the mode merely shifts to G minor, but later on, scalar runs and arpeggios with augmented seconds bring the ethnic nature of the conflict into focus. So now let's hear both examples. Shapiro. Although the Kishineff Massacre certainly borrows from the battle music tradition, it notably does not contain much actual battle music. Instead, Shapiro focuses on the victims, directing the listener towards the work's didactic function. Many battle pieces include a brief lamentation section to represent fallen troops on either side of the fight. So here's one from the Battle of Waterloo from 1910, and you can see it's the title, Lamentation, Adagio, so it's slow, con espressione, or with expression. It's very lyrical and subdued piece of music. This is a very interesting one from Charles Grobe's Battle of Fort Donelson. And in this case, the music is very choral-like something a four-part choir might sing in church. The music is actually My Country 'Tis of Thee, and the text is the names of the Northern soldiers who had died in the battle. And you can see them all listed there. So if you were performing this piece at home and someone was narrating the work, they would actually read through all the names, possibly people who died in the battle. So it's a very affective way of lamenting the fallen. In the Kishineff Massacre, however, Shapiro composes more lamentation than action, reserving 3 of the work's 7 sections for this purpose. Unlike the other parts of the composition, these excerpts predominantly feature stereotypically Jewish music, slow tempi, inflections of the so-called Ahavarabba scale, and cantorial gestures and ornaments. The first example, labeled The Victims in Their Agony, is a brief depiction of anguish, 3 chords played in tremolo, followed by a plaintive cadenza. For the descriptive labels of the 2 other examples, Shapiro draws directly from the text of Frug's poem, emphasizing the connection between this piece of musical entertainment and the campaign that inspired the poetry. Of special note is the 3rd lamentation, The Living Cry for Bread, which alludes to the refrain that ends each stanza of the poem and serves as the finale of the entire composition. The refrain reads, "Brethren, sisters, mercy, mercy, grave and awful is the woe. Hasten shrouds to wrap the dead. Hasten, give the living bread." The living cry for bread is easily the longest section in Shapiro's Massacre. Its stately tempo, mournful character, and repetition of motives heard in the first 2 lamentation sections help create a suitable anti-finale for the work. In a recent article on descriptive piano works, Jonathan Bellman notes how Kochvar's Battle of Prague and many other descriptive works end with a familiar song. The Living Cry for Bread is certainly the most song-like section, and even if it is original music, its characteristic melodic motives are similar to other plaintive Jewish tunes. Here is the opening. Shapiro's publisher must have noted the potential for the living cry for bread to be heard as a paradigm of tragic Jewish music, for they included an excerpt of this section as an advertisement for Shapiro's work in the sheet music for Joseph Rumshinsky's 1906 arrangement of the Yiddish song Eli, Eli, a classic of Jewish pathos throughout the 20th century. And here's the edition, also from the Library of Congress collection. And you can see the cover, and then when you'd open the cover, the first thing you would see would be this page of music from Shapiro's work as a kind of advertisement for it. Here's what that tune sounds like. Very similar in character. In short, Shapiro's Kishineff Massacre follows in the tradition of battle music for solo piano, but alters it significantly by directing its performers' and listeners' attention towards the tragic losers of the battle, using stock, stereotypical gestures to generate sympathy for the Jewish cause. It is likely that well-to-do Jewish families in America, who would have already been familiar with the battle genre, could easily understand its new context and be moved to act on its charitable exhortations. While Shapiro's musical depiction of the Kishineff Pogrom does not convey the Zionist sentiments common to the American press reports, another work by the composer reveals how his tragic Jewish battle piece might be aligned with the Zionist cause. Shapiro would draw his audiences further towards the Jewish poetics of domestic music making with his Dr. Herzl Elegy for solo piano, which he published in July 1904, 5 months after his Kishineff Massacre and just 1 month after the death of Theodor Herzl. That Shapiro would musically honor the life of the Zionist leader on the heels of his Kishineff piece suggests that his earlier composition should not stand apart from the Zionist enthusiasm that followed the tragedy. The opening, Andante, in G Ahava Rabbah, shares the same tonal center, G, tempo, and character of the living cry for bread from the Kishineff Massacre, hinting that the newer work begins where the previous piece left off. All of the remaining sections, which Shapiro introduces with either Yiddish odes to Herzl by George Selikovich or descriptive titles, feature the same musical elements used to signify Jewishness in the Kishineff Massacre. Furthermore, connections to European musical topics are far less apparent than in the previous work. In the Elegy, the listener is not invited to hear Jewish music in opposition to Western idioms. To the contrary, as German musicologist Yasha Nemtsov notes in his book Zionism in Music, Shapiro turns to klezmer, incorporating authentic-sounding tunes and accompaniment patterns that mimic the hammered dulcimer. For example, let's hear the opening of the section Hoffnungstenor von Zion's Harp, or Hope's Hand on Zion's Harp. Shapiro subtitled the elegy Funeral Meditations on the Death of the Jewish Siegfried, Zion's Architect, a reference to the mythic German hero and subject of Richard Wagner's Ring Cycle. It may be surprising that Theodor Herzl was a huge fan of the anti-Semitic composer Richard Wagner, but it is quite true, and Shapiro may have shared his enthusiasm. The three-flat key signature seen throughout the elegy might be a reference to Siegfried's funeral music in Act 3 of Götterdämmerung, and the musical material in one section of the elegy is reminiscent of a Wagnerian leitmotif. Other parts of the elegy, however, show little Wagnerian influence. In this composition, Jewish folk styles account for much of the musical material. Even in the final movement labeled "In the Future," which is marked allegramente, or cheerfully, one can imagine a klezmer tooting joyfully on a clarinet. In comparison with the sonic world of the Kishineff Massacre, we might hear the elegy as a musical realization of the Zionist dream, a space in which Jewish culture dominates throughout. On the other hand, Herman Shapiro's most popular printed work was a collection of Jewish wedding dances, and it is just as possible that to compose the Herzl elegy quickly, he chose klezmer idioms because he was already adept at it and could complete the elegy ahead of his competition. So now let's turn to the record I found in the Youngstown JCC's collection. It is difficult to assess the impact of Shapiro's works for solo piano, and because they were likely played in private domestic settings, it is also unlikely that we will find concert programs or reviews that document performances. There is evidence, however, that Shapiro's Kishineff Massacre influenced later musical representations of the pogrom. In 1924, the Victor Talking Machine Company released a recording by conductor Nathaniel Shilkret and the International Concert Orchestra of another descriptive Kishineff Massacre. The marketing classification, Yiddish Descriptive Overture, and Yiddish writing on the disc certify that this recording was marketed to Jewish audiences. Victor discographies provide some basic details about the production, but no information exists that might tell us for certain what this descriptive overture is meant to describe. The 1924 recording of Kishineff Massacre follows the conventions of the earlier work for piano. For example, Shapiro's work begins with the short intro, "The First Signal of the Storm," which features foreboding repeated octaves punctuated with thick chords. The opening on the record includes a similar gesture, but this time the ominous pedal point is played by trombones, the usual harbingers of death in Western European classical music. The Jews are to be represented by slow music containing Orientalist inflections and rhapsodic cadenzas played on violin or clarinet. The violence of the event is represented by up-tempo attack sections, the first of which does not show any stereotypical markers of Jewishness and sounds like finale music for an operatic overture. The second up-tempo section, the work's finale, sounds like an Eastern European dance introduced by trumpet calls. Although the ethnic character of the music is not distinct, it may reflect the reports of a journalist who noted that in the immediate aftermath of the pogrom, indifferent citizens gathered each evening in the Royal Garden in Kishineff to, quote, and this is Monty Penkower's translation, to enjoy the music of the Dragoon Band, which performed Polish polkas as well as Hungarian czardas and Russian marches in faultless fashion. Without further documentation, we have to use our imagination to determine the intended image evoked by each section of the overture. The timing of the recording is peculiar, as it appears during an era of uncertainty for Jews in the United States. According to Eric Goldstein in The Price of Whiteness, white America had become increasingly anxious in the 1920s about the so-called Jewish problem, and debates over the place of Jews in American society carried forth in published articles, symposia, and exposés. Furthermore, although America had been the #1 destination for Jewish immigrants leaving Europe, the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 restricted their entry, forcing many immigrants to settle in Palestine. Given the unstable nature of Jewish life in America at that time, it seems odd that Victor would release a recording that would remind Jews of recent atrocities committed by a host nation. On the other hand, record company executives were not too concerned about the content of the ethnic records they produced. For one example, L.L. Seabook, who was Columbia's head of ethnic records, wrote in a 1920 issue of Talking Machine World that, quote, "The foreigner is not particular in his selection of foreign music. Simply he desires music which reminds him of his old folks and his old home. There's hardly any of the foreign records which will not do this," unquote. The recording of the Kishineff Massacre could certainly evoke memories of Russia, although not necessarily pleasant ones. The Victor recording also suggests how Jewish American engagement with the plight of European Jews may have changed by the 1920s. In a 1906 essay, The Menace of Mechanical Music, America's most famous bandleader and composer of the era, John Philip Sousa, raged against the fledgling phonograph industry. Above all other complaints, Sousa argued that the proliferation of talking machines would produce a terrible change in America's musical culture, noting, quote, "For when music can be heard in the homes without the labor of study and close application, and without the slow process of acquiring a technique, it will be simply a question of time when the amateur disappears entirely," unquote. Although Sousa's scholar, Pat Warfield, has demonstrated that Sousa was more interested in revising copyright laws than protecting America's musical heritage, Sousa's prophecy may be telling. In 1904, young Jewish women or men may have practiced Shapiro's Kishineff Massacre for hours, perfecting their skills of execution and interpretation. They would have performed the piece at family gatherings, showing off their talents while sharing the work's urgent message. Anyone in the house or apartment during practice sessions or performances may have seen the sheet music, asked questions, and learned about the situation. The 1924 recording, on the other hand, would require much less engagement from its audience and serve more as a memorial of the pogrom than a call to action. And I'd like to conclude by discussing the placement of this recording in Victor's catalog of ethnic records. The International Concert Orchestra's discography covers a variety of ethnic styles, which the label could have easily marketed to various immigrant groups. Most of the choices are nostalgic. There are waltzes for the Viennese, music by Edvard Grieg for the Norwegians, and folk songs for the Russians. The only international concert orchestra disc that was marketed to Jews and features what one might call Jewish music is this Kishineff Massacre. The listing suggests that whereas some immigrant groups wanted to dance the night away or sing folk songs, the Jewish community, 20 years after Kishineff, preferred to contemplate their suffering and fragile safety among Gentile nations. Perhaps Shapiro's Kishineff Massacre helped establish a soundtrack for such a practice. Thank you.
I can talk loud too. I can talk very loud. Okay, so you talked there at the end about the printer or the publisher, the Victor, in their context of this record. I was wondering about the publisher of the sheet music itself. So was that a Jewish publisher marketing for Jewish audiences, or did they also have other, I don't know,
That's, for
Christmas
us, I can tell
music
that's mostly
too?
a Jewish publisher, Randall Goldberg, yeah.
Say that again, Rennie, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that was a Jewish publisher. I don't know if he published Jewish music exclusively, but he published a lot of it. Obviously, the ties between the Kishineff Massacre and the score for Eli Eli, I mean, it shows he has a distinct marketing niche. And the Hebrew titles on it's Yiddish language, but Hebrew letters on there, show who's supposed to buy that stuff. Yeah. Yes?
Is Goldberg the first, Gershwin's first biographer, I think? Does anyone know that?
Osna Goldberg?
Excuse me, I have the name wrong, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Never mind.
Thank you for an excellent lecture, really well structured and very informative. So in the introduction, your dissertation was referred to as an Italian Renaissance, whatever. And I'm curious, this is kind of a far cry from that. So was there any relationship in doing this kind of research to what you originally did your dissertation work? And what did you bring to this from that experience?
I guess I can answer that question by talking about how I got into Jewish music studies, which I did at the same time I was working on my dissertation work. I went to Indiana University, and we had a great, diverse musicology faculty there. And I can also use this time to thank some of my friends from IU who are in the audience tonight. There was a seminar at the time. I came studying musicology thinking I would study early music. But there's a terrific scholar at IU, he's at University of Illinois now, named Jeff McGee, and he had a seminar on Jewish identity in music. And that's where I was first introduced to a lot of these ideas. I had performed klezmer music and studied that just as a performer. But in that seminar, for which I was actually the only Jewish person in it, so I really enjoyed it very much, and it opened me up to a lot of ways of thinking about myself and about this music. And I did my final project on a living musician, David Krakauer, a clarinetist, and his music. And it was from that I got interested in this topic. And then, I decided to write my dissertation on Italian music theory because I really wanted to learn the language, and I was learning about Galileo's father. All that stuff was very fascinating. But, it's easy to draw back to get into Jewish music for me. This was my childhood and everything, and growing up in the synagogue, and then all of a sudden, you're uncovering this history that you didn't know existed. So it was a very thing, and the research was wonderful because every morning I would get up, I would actually get to my office at the university early just so I would have an extra 30 or 45 minutes to build this database. And through these online archives, I was, finding information of all these records and listening to just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of records and just realizing how much stuff was out there. So, I don't know, I think there's probably some connection between the early music, but I think mostly I just like a lot of music. I like everything, so at any time I can work on something that interests me is great. Thanks for the question.
I hope I'm doing this right, I'm not sure, but maybe you can hear my voice anyway.
Sure.
The Kishineff Massacre was also the impetus for the creation of the American Jewish Committee in 1906. And that was a formation of a group of wealthy German Jewish Wall Street bankers who felt that the Kishineff Massacre simply could not be tolerated anymore, and they had to take some action. You mentioned also that it was the impetus for, was it Jewish participation in the formation of the NAACP? and another group,
The ACLU.
the ACLU. Could you expand on that a little bit?
Mostly what I know is from Eric Goldstein's book. But I mean, or no, that was from Steven Zipperstein's lecture. But Eric Goldstein talks a lot about this in the book, The Price of Whiteness. And things I know about Jewish-Black relations from scholars such as Sheryl Greenberg, who wrote a great book about that. I think these were social issues. I'm not an expert in this area, but they were social issues that Jews, and especially the Jews in New York, had sort of established themselves in America. They wanted to get involved in. They're just very active, and you're right. This pogrom is seen as a turning point. I think there's a famous article about the Kishineff pogrom called "The Turning Point," the Kishineff pogrom. I think the ADL was also formed shortly after this pogrom, because it was the idea was the Jews we need somebody to protect them, because they're living in these towns and they have no protection when these things happen. As far as their involvement in the NAACP, I believe the organization was started mostly by Jews, as I guess in a kind of social activism, saying we need to protect, this minority in America because they don't have people protecting them. And the same with the ACLU. This is an organization that protects people's rights. So how it was the Kishineff Massacre that caused all this to happen, Zipperstein at least claims it's because there was this person, Jakob Bernstein Kogan, in Kishineff, who was very much involved in political Zionism, and he knew this was the kind of political event. Not that he's exaggerating the event, but it's, that's in politics, right? You use an event. If I have an agenda, say it's gun control, when there's a shooting somewhere, I'm going to say, let's talk about gun control. Here's why. The Kishineff pogrom is a great time for this person to say, look, we need a homeland. Here's why. And so that just, spurned all these other activities. I don't know much about the formation of these organizations, though.
I believe that Zipperstein has a book coming out early next year on the Kishineff Massacre, and I believe it's something like The Kishineff Massacre and the Tilt of History. So that should be well worth reading.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, could you tell us a little bit more about Shapiro? Was he born in the U.S.? How did he come to be have such a career in music? Obviously not easy teaching with a teaching schedule like that, but what were some of his other achievements, et cetera, et cetera?
I haven't found much about him. I haven't really dug into the archives. When I did some archival work on this project, I was studying other musicians. I came to Shapiro later, so all I know, the Irene Heskes catalog here lists all of his publications. Obviously, that review of a concert is conveniently inside one of his pieces of sheet music, so anyone can see it. I really don't know much about him. I've looked in YIVO. I couldn't find anything on YIVO's website or anything in their library catalog, so I really don't know. He's not a musician who's really been picked up by other, performing ensembles. You don't hear about this music being performed much, because the music's it's not really concert music like Liszt or Chopin. It's really, was designed for these, domestic performances. So, sorry, I don't know. I really don't know much about him. It's somewhat, this paper is very speculative, although I think most of it works together pretty well, pieces together pretty well.
Just curiosity. Since you started with the Italian Renaissance, and since there is one major figure in the Italian Renaissance of Jewish background, Solomon Rossi, I'm wondering if you have, in the wanderings across the span of music, whether you see this kind of musical expression as something of an assertion of a separate Jewish identity, whereas most of the musicians, the composers at least, but in many cases the performers of Jewish background in the classical music tradition going all the way back to the Renaissance were kind of trying to say more like, me too, I can be a part of a more mainstream thing, whether that is something of a contrast that you see, and whether in fact something like a massacre of this, even though it's not that large a massacre, but the effect it has on the world's imagination, not just Jewish imagination, is a pivot point in that regard?
Thanks. That's an interesting question. And yeah, Salmo Nirazi is a perfect example of a composer. Writes in Hebrew, but it sounds like Palestrina. It's just gorgeous polyphony. When I look at this stuff, I look through it more, not so much, well, I talked about a lot of the background of this music and kind of Western European classical traditions. This is more of like mass-marketed, popular music. And in America around the turn of the 20th century, there's so much of this going on in Tin Pan Alley and all the publishing houses. And they're working very hard to appeal to distinct marketing niches. So using these, almost kind of stereotypes of what might sound Jewish works really well to show that that is supposed to be Jewish music. It's a little bit like how in silent films or in cartoons or something, if in a cartoon, if a Jewish person comes on the screen, you have to hear Hava Nagila. It's like, it's a little bit cartoonish like that. And it's, yeah, there is a lot of cantorial music that sounds like this, and certain types of Jewish worship music that sound like this. But it's so much more, I think, the composer as marketing to their audience, to me, in a sense. There are all kinds of debates at this time. One is by the writer Lazar Saminsky, who was a Russian Jewish composer, and he writes in his book on music in the ghetto of the Bible, saying that all of this kind of I hate to use the term exotic inflection, what musicians would call augmented seconds, all these things are actually corruptions of real Jewish music. That the real music of the Bible wouldn't have had these things. It was just picked up by Jews wandering through Central Asia. So there's always kind of disputes. But in American, I think still, if people want something to sound Jewish, they play a tune and they have they have those intervals in there. People say, oh, that's supposed to represent Jews. That's the way I'm kind of looking at it in this paper. If you look at later in the 20th century into someone like Leonard Bernstein, some of the things he puts in his symphonies, when he's quoting the blessing before reading a Haftorah in one of his symphonies, I mean, clearly he's trying to create a Jewish sound that the Jews will recognize as being Jewish, and it's similar to that. But it's hard for me to think of Herman Shapiro the same way I might think of someone like Felix Mendelssohn, like, as you know, who's someone who's really trying to show he's part of the Western classical tradition, or Meyerbeer, or some of those other composers. He's writing music to a mass market. He's not so much writing music to please, the Neue Zeitschrift for music in Germany. He's writing for his, for people to buy sheet music. I don't know if that answers everything.
You mentioned the speed of the communication and the publications in the U.S. about the massacre. And I'm curious about the back influence or knowledge or awareness of the music, this composition, or the reaction in America back in where it happened and the surrounding communities.
It's hard. I haven't found, as I know in the paper, I haven't really found documented performances. So it's hard, it's hard to find information about something people would have done at home without doing that. And it's interesting because I've had, with other obscure Yiddish songs that I've studied as a result of this research, I've sometimes found those songs in very obscure newspaper articles saying, the board of Jewish people in this town met and they had songs, and this person sang this song. And sometimes I'll actually find a documented performance, but for this music, I'm not sure.
I guess I was thinking more generally, not necessarily specifically, but was there a two-way communication? Was it mostly, you talked about this network that existed, and how much support they felt from what was happening here.
The community back in Russia.
Yes.
It's a good question. I know a lot of money was raised, and there was a lot of money. There was a lot of all kinds of benefits being done. There was a lot of activity in Washington about it. They really wanted the U.S. government. People really wanted the U.S. government to get involved. I'm not sure what happened in those communities, though. I can't think of anything. Mostly what I read in my research was all these writers visiting there and then writing about it. For example, that Irish author I mentioned, there's some famous Jewish poets who went there and wrote wrote these other poems. One's called, I think, Streets of Blood, that all Israelis now, I believe, know very. Am I getting the name of it right? Yeah, what's
The Bialik poem.
Yeah, the Bialik poem.
His response.
Right. He went there.
He wrote it a year after.
Mm-hmm.
The City of
Blood.
Bloodshed.
Yeah, City of Blood. Right, and so some of these works have continued on. I know I've gotten away from your question, but yeah, I'm not sure about what the people in the community knew. I know they knew funding was coming in and aid and help, but a lot of them were just mostly probably trying to get out of there and get to America. 1903, they could still emigrate.
Great. Well, thanks so much. We really appreciate it.
Well, thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.